Good morning, everyone. This is Russell Rucker, and I'm here for another constitutional talk. Now, the other week we were talking about the Stamp Act Congress, and one of the things that they achieved was the Declaration of Rights and Grievances. And we're talking about 1765 here. But I thought it would behoove me to actually read it to you so you had a better understanding what exactly this document is. Now, this was produced by the Stamp Act Congress, and I'll just read it to you. The members of this Congress, sincerely devoted with the warmest sentiments of affection and duty to His Majesty's person and government, inviolably attached to the present happy establishment of the Protestant succession, and with minds deeply impressed by the sense of the present and impending misfortunes of the British colonies on this continent. Having considered as maturely as time would permit the circumstances of said colonies, esteem to our dispensable duty to make the following declarations of our humble opinions respecting the most essential rights and liberties of the colonists and the grievances upon which they labor by reason of several actions of Parliament. Okay. I just want to stop there for a moment and get into what exactly we're talking about here. And we're talking about the Stamp Act itself and the taxation that came along with the Stamp Act. What you have to understand is initially when we had things like molasses tax and the sugar tax, those things you could get around and by smuggling. But the Stamp Act you could not get around because every official paper was stamped with it. Dice were stamped, cards. Anytime you had to go to court, these kind of things were all in play. So there was really no way around this tax. So it made it quite different than even the tax on tea. So here we get into the numbered complaints that we're talking about. First, that His Majesty's subjects in these colonies owe the same allegiance to the Crown of Great Britain that is owing from his subjects born within the realm, and all due subordination to that august body, the Parliament of Great Britain. Second, that His Majesty's liege subjects in these colonies are entitled to all the inherent rights and privileges of the natural born subjects within the Kingdom of Great Britain. So in these first two, they're actually arguing that they are equal to British subjects. And this was one of the things going on at the time. They thought that they had the same rights as their British brethren. Third, that is inseparably essential to the freedom of the people and the undoubted rights of Englishmen, that no tax should be imposed on them but with their own consent, given personally or by their representatives. And this is where we get into no taxation without representation, because the colonies were not represented in Parliament. And this was a big problem that the colonists had. Fourth, that the people of these colonies are not, and from their local circumstances cannot be represented in of the House of Commons in Great Britain. Not only was it that they didn't have representation, that we had a great sea between them. You had the Atlantic Ocean. It was not easy to just cross when there was a problem and address Parliament, and that's assuming they would allow you to address them. Fifth, that no representative of the people of these colonies are persons chosen therein by themselves, and that no taxes ever have been or can be constitutionally imposed on them but by their respective legislatures. Some of our colonies did have legislatures. We had governors that were appointed by the crown, And this was really the problem. There was nowhere to address grievances. Sixth, that all supplies to the crown being free gifts of the people, it is unreasonable and inconsistent with the principles and spirit of the British Constitution for the people of Great Britain to grant to His Majesty the property of the colonies. Now, this is another thing that's kind of interesting. You know, we argue about the Constitution all the time, our Constitution. Well, they had a British Constitution, and they knew that as well as we know ours. Seven, that trial by jury is an inherent and invaluable right of every British subject in these colonies. Eighth, that the late Act of Parliament entitled an Act for granting and applying certain stamp duties and other duties in the British colonies and plantations of American company by imposing taxes on the inhabitants of these colonies, and the said act and several other acts by extending the jurisdiction of the courts of admiralty beyond its ancient limits, have a manifest tendency to subvert the rights and liberties of the colonists. So as we go through these, you kind of get a sense of where they're coming from, and they really are incensed over the Stamp Act. And because it was an act, it was impossible to get around if you wanted to do any legal business, if you wanted to get married, for instance, if you wanted wills, if you had to go to court because you've been accused of something. All these things had expenses taxed them. Just getting a newspaper, each page had to be stamped. Ninth, that the duties imposed by several late acts of Parliament from the peculiar circumstances of these colonies will be extremely burdensome and grievous, and from the scarcity of specie, the payment of them absolutely impractical. And why is it impractical? Because all these payments had to be done in silver coin, which was in short supply. You couldn't use printed script. 10th, that as the profits of the trade of these colonies ultimately center in Great Britain to pay for the manufactures which they are obliged to take from thence, they eventually contribute very largely to all supplies granted there to the crown. 11th, that the restrictions imposed by several late acts of Parliament on the trade of these colonies will render them unable to purchase the manufactures of Great Britain. Now, keep in mind, even all vessels had to be built with British subjects. The Act of the Sea at the time meant that everything had to be 75% British sailors. It was an immense problem. They were trying to tie down the colonies and make them adhere to trade only with Great Britain. 12th, that the increased prosperity and happiness of these colonies depend on full and free enjoyment of their rights and liberties and intercourse with Great Britain mutually affectionate and advantageous. And 13th, that is the right of the British subjects in these colonies to petition the king of either house of Parliament. Lastly, that is the indispensable duty of these colonies to the best of sovereigns, to the mother country, and to themselves, to endeavor by a loyal and dutiful address to His Majesty and humble application to both houses of Parliament to procure the repeal of the act for granting and applying certain stamp duties, all clauses of any other acts of Parliament, whereby the jurisdiction of the Admiralty is extended as aforesaid, and of the other late acts of the restrictions of the American commerce. And then we have the problem with the king not willing to accept the Stamp Act. Congress and some of our governors were refusing to send people. They called it an illegal meeting, and so they weren't willing to take us seriously. And this, my friends, is the problem. The inability of them to even address their grievances to Parliament, to the king. All these things really matter. I hope you get something from this and get a better understanding of what our colonists were up against. And we'll catch you next time on the next Constitutional Talk. Please subscribe and follow me. There's nothing more important than our liberty. We'll see you next week on the next Constitutional Talk.